The Klamath River, once the third largest salmon-producing river on the West Coast, is the site of the largest dam removal project in history, and right now it's facing a problem that nobody expected to hit this fast. In June 2026, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service officials reported that 46% of juvenile Chinook salmon tested in the Upper Klamath River were infected with a microscopic parasite called Ceratonova shasta. That's more than double the infection rate from 2025. At one testing site near the former Iron Gate Dam, more than 50% of the young Chinook found in traps were dead. At another site, 80% were dead. And here's the uncomfortable part. The very act that was supposed to save these fish, removing 4 massive dams that had blocked 420 miles of river for over a century, may have also opened the door for this parasite to spread into waters it hadn't reached in 100 years. So let's talk about what's actually happening. Ceratonova shasta is a microscopic organism native to Pacific Northwest rivers. It's been around for a long time, and it only attacks salmon and trout. It cannot infect humans, but what it does to fish is brutal. Once C. shasta enters a salmon through its gills, it migrates to the intestines, where it causes hemorrhaging and necrosis. Light infections can sometimes be fought off, but heavy infections are a death sentence, especially when water temperatures are high. And it's not just Chinook. Coho salmon and steelhead trout are also susceptible to C. shasta, meaning the parasite threat spans the full salmonid community of the Klamath Basin. The life cycle of this parasite involves 2 hosts. The first is a tiny freshwater worm called Monounchia speciosa, about the size of an eyelash, roughly 3 millimeters long. These worms live on the river bottom, filter feeding and building little flexible tubes attached to the substrate. When infected fish die and decompose in the river, the worms ingest the mature parasite spores, then release a different stage of the parasite, called actinospores, back into the water. Those actinospores attach to a salmon's gills, invade the bloodstream, replicate, and migrate to the intestinal tract. Fish infects worm, worm infects fish. The cycle repeats. Now here's where the dams come in. For decades, the 4 hydroelectric dams on the Klamath created conditions that supercharged this cycle. The dammed sections produced warm, slow-moving, nutrient-rich water, perfect for growing thick beds of an algae called cladophora. That algae provided ideal habitat for the polychaete worms that host C. shasta, and more worms meant more parasites in the water. The dams also concentrated fish in overcrowded stretches below the barriers, making infection almost unavoidable. In 2021, after years of drought, juvenile salmon deaths from C. shasta in the lower Klamath reached into the hundreds of thousands. Disease outbreaks left nearly 97% of the Yurok tribe's salmon catch infected. This pattern of catastrophic loss wasn't new. Back in 2002, a historic fish kill wiped out more than 34,000 adult Chinook in the lower river in a single event, one of the largest salmon die-offs ever recorded in the United States. That disaster galvanized tribes, conservationists, and regulators, and became one of the defining moments in the long push to tear the dams out. This was one of the key reasons so many people fought for decades to tear those dams down. And they did. The project was overseen by the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, KRRC, the nonprofit entity created specifically to manage the dam removal after the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, approved PacifiCorp's license surrender in 2022. That regulatory green light set the $500 million project in motion. Workers dismantled all 4 dams in sequence. J.C. Boyle Dam in Oregon, then Copco No. 1 and Copco No. 2, and finally Iron Gate Dam, all built between 1918 and 1962. Removal began in summer 2023, and on October 2, 2024, the last piece of dam was pulled from the river. The very next night, on October 3rd at 10:06 p.m., sonar equipment recorded the first Chinook salmon swimming upstream. The results were immediate and, honestly, stunning. Within 10 days of completing the final work at Iron Gate Dam, more than 6,000 Chinook were observed migrating into newly accessible habitat. The fall 2025 run shattered every prediction. Over 51,000 adult Chinook returned to the basin, 180% of what had been forecasted. Nearly 39,860 adults reached natural spawning areas, essentially meeting the long-term escapement goal in the very first year. Fish were seen spawning in the Williamson River and Sprague River in Oregon, tributaries upstream of Klamath Lake, where salmon hadn't been spotted in over 100 years. Commercial ocean salmon fishing reopened in 2026 after being closed for 3 straight years. Damon Goodman of California Trout put it plainly, the river seemed to come alive almost instantly after removal, and the fish returned in greater numbers than anyone expected. But nature is never that clean, and this is where the story gets complicated. Those 4 dams didn't just block fish, they also blocked the parasite. Sea shasta and its worm hosts were largely confined to the lower river, so when the dams came down and salmon surged upstream into Oregon for the first time in a century, the parasite followed. Scientists expected this would happen eventually. They did not expect it to happen this fast. Oregon State University fish parasitologist Sasha Hallett, who has studied parasites in the Klamath Basin for more than 20 years, described the situation as concerning. She noted that juvenile salmon were dying in visible groups along the riverbanks. These are juveniles. They're small. So for there to be so many that you can see groups of them along the sides of the river, that's concerning. She also pointed out that this is the first time juvenile Chinook mortalities from sea shasta have been documented in Oregon since the dams were removed. Climate is making everything worse. The 2026 water year has been marked by low snowpack, early snowmelt, low flows, and high water temperatures, essentially perfect conditions for sea shasta to thrive. Warm water stresses the fish, weakens their immune response, and accelerates parasite reproduction. It's a compounding problem. So what does this actually mean for the river's future? Chinook Vice Chairman Kenneth Brink offered the clearest framing. Dam removal gave the Klamath River and our fish a fighting chance. But no one should confuse dam removal with an instant cure. The river was damaged for more than a century. It will take time, strong winter flows, habitat restoration, and continued care to bring it back to health. The data actually supports cautious optimism alongside the alarm. Early spring sea shasta levels in 2024 and 2025, the first 2 years after dam removal, ran lower than levels recorded during previous drought years before the dams came down. Harmful algal blooms are smaller and less frequent. The underlying conditions that supercharge the parasite cycle for decades are genuinely improving. It's also worth putting the mortality in context. A pair of Chinook salmon typically produces around 4,000 offspring, and even under ideal conditions, more than 99% of those offspring will die from pathogens or predation before reaching adulthood. Some juvenile mortality from parasites is not just expected, it's a natural part of the salmon life cycle. The real question is whether this mortality falls within that natural range, or whether it's tipping into something more dangerous for populations that are still fragile. Researchers across multiple agencies are racing to find out right now. The investment in recovery continues in the meantime. California's Fall Creek Fish Hatchery, a $35 million facility in its second year of operation, has already collected 1.27 million eggs, 4 times the number from the same point last year. The state has invested over $30 million in habitat restoration across the basin, and work continues on the 2,200 acres of formerly submerged land behind the old dams. For the tribes of the Klamath, the Yurok, Chinook, Klamath tribes, Hoopa Valley, and Shasta Indian Nation, the stakes go beyond biology. The Yurok word for salmon is nepui. It means food itself. The Klamath tribes call salmon chials, a word that carries its own weight of history and loss. The tribal origin story holds that the spirit who created salmon also created humans. When the dams went up in the early 20th century, the decline of salmon was linked to rising rates of diabetes and heart disease in tribal communities. Their return is, quite literally, a matter of survival. The Klamath River is healing. The parasite problem is real. Both of those things are true at the same time. What happens next depends on water conditions, continued restoration work, and whether a river that was broken for a century is given the time it needs to finish putting itself back together.